Here's the new book, Lemuria, a true story of a fake place. Check that out, Lemuria, the true story of a fake place. All right. Hey, Justin, how you doing?
Doing lovely. How are you doing today, Michael?
Where are you? Are you in West
I am
Virginia?
in West. Yep, I'm still in West Virginia.
Oh, nice. So, what's your story? How did you get into this? I'll introduce the topic in a second, but yeah, how'd you get into all this kind of? I don't know if you call it alternative history or alternative archaeology, or I don't know how you characterize it.
Oh, it has a lot of pseudos behind it. I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of
yeah.
pseudo archaeology, pseudo-science, pseudo-history, a little bit of everything around it. So, I love history. I've always loved the stories behind history, and so getting into just finding stories and finding interesting things to talk about. And also, I just love weird things just from as a kid growing up and watching unsolved mysteries and
Oh,
stuff
yeah.
like that. It got me into it. So just being around history and just weird topics in general, like the two just kind of combined. And so honestly, when the pandemic hit and stuck at home and looking for stuff to do, for some people it's crafting or something along those lines. For me, it's researching books, I guess. And so it was just an interesting topic I knew a little bit about, and then once I started diving deeper into it, finding more and more, I was like, oh wow, this is really interesting.
Yeah, it is it's a compelling subject. All of this, the kind of fringes, margins, borderlands is what we deal with at Skeptic, really.
Yeah.
Unsolved mysteries, history's mysteries. The going back to that Leonard Nimoy show in the '70s, In Search of. It's
Oh
just
yeah.
endless, even today. Just the endless stream of topics. It's something about the margins where you can't quite make out what's going on. The photograph is blurry, the video is kind of grainy, and the proponent goes, if you squint and kind of use your imagination, you can see what I'm talking about here, and you're like, yeah, I don't know.
It seems like a lot of the UFO or UAP videos coming out these days are like that too, and it's just like you would think that with video technology there would be better videos
Yeah,
out
there's
there
how
of
many
stuff being.
billions of these things on the planet now, and we still don't have any
Yeah.
high res. And even campers and hikers have the cell phones in their pockets. You'd think we'd have Bigfoot and Yeti by now captured on
You're
camera.
right. Mm-hmm. And the Air Force and the armed forces and even their videos that they're producing are not what you think
Right,
was high quality too. So
right,
who knows?
right. So we don't have to say it's 100% not true. It could be. It's just,
Yeah.
do you have some evidence for it? What can you
Mm-hmm.
show us? That's kind of how, show me the body. In the case of Bigfoot, people have been talking about it and looking for it for really centuries now, and it's been a hot topic for at least a century. And I remember reading Reinhold Messner's memoir. He's the German alpinist who summited 7 times, I think, without oxygen,
Oh
Mount
wow.
Everest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he was he always had a side gig looking for a Yeti in the Himalayas. And he always told the Sherpas, if you see one, wake me up at the tent. So one day, one of his Sherpas woke him up and said, "It's Yeti, it's Yeti, it's right around the bend." So he runs out there, and it's a bear. And he goes, "Oh, that's Yeti." And he go, "Yeah, that's Yeti." He's like, "Oh, okay." So anyway, Lemuria. So what's the story? Okay, so let's do it this way. Let's look at kind of the history of the concept specifically and the people that promoted it and why they were doing it, and then toward the end we'll pull back and look at the larger picture of Atlantis and the romancing of the past and what it is that appeals to people about this kind of utopian past. Things were beautiful back then and now they're not, and all that kind of utopian ideology that's behind that.
Yeah, so like if people don't know what Lemuria is, it is the great lost continent of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. So think about Atlantis over in the Atlantic. What Atlantis is to the Atlantic Ocean, Lemuria is to the Pacific and Indian Oceans. A lot more recent though. It's only been around since 1864, or at least the idea of Lemuria has only been around since this British ornithologist was researching or just basically covering the mammals on Madagascar and how they how all the life form got onto Madagascar. And then he got to like the most famous mammal on Madagascar, the lemur there. And so he was, comparing all of these different lemurs and lemur-like species in South America and Africa, and lemurs on Madagascar, and also lemur-like species in India and elsewhere in Asia. And so he said there had to have been a land bridge connecting all of these different places. And at the very, very end of his talk, he just says, and you know what, let's just call it Lemuria. And the name just stuck ever since then. So it was based on, very from a scientific person, based on scientific ideas, all around, trying to, figure out animal migration patterns in the 19th century, basically. And that's where this, little lost continent came from, is this idea of land bridges, basically.
Yeah. Let me see if I have it. Oh, yeah. I wrote a biography of Alfred Russell Wallace.
Oh, nice. Okay. Lovely.
Yeah. He's one of the founders of island biogeography in general, but island biogeography in particular. All the way up through, Ed Wilson. That was what he did. That's how he made his name in studying island biogeography. So the problem to explain is, how do species get to these islands? Yes. Madagascar is maybe 300 kilometers off the coast of Africa, something like that.
Yeah.
And, the Galapagos is 600 miles. Hawaii's 3,000 miles. How did the animals get there? So the land bridge was one, and that's not a crazy idea. It could be.
Yeah. Especially for a place like Madagascar, too, which is, fairly close to Africa. And I go into a book about recent dredging of the Mozambique Channel and looking at recent studies that have, said that within the past, 30, 40 million years, that, there were some peaks there that might have been exposed to the land. So creating like almost like island hopping situation for species to get from there. Yeah.
Well, here's that map of where, this was not Lemuria, but related to that in the Pacific. But more specifically, the original version was in the Indian Ocean, right?
Yes,
I'm looking for that map you have here.
It should be with Haeckel's. Haeckel's map is...
Yeah, Haeckel's map, right. Ernst oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah, there it is. Okay, see that in the map there, in the camera. And it's not a crazy idea, because how did lemurs how do we think today lemurs got to Madagascar, or vice versa? Maybe they evolved there and went to Africa from there.
Exactly. So there's basically two theories out right now. One is very much like a land bridge, or there's these exposed pieces of the Davy Ridge, which I believe is the name of the underwater ridge that runs along the Mozambique Channel there. So basically peaks of that were exposed over millions of years that kind of created a quasi land bridge that allowed species from Africa onto Madagascar, or vice versa. And the other one is a theory put forth by George Gaylord Simpson, who was an American anthropologist, or he worked for the Smithsonian, or
he was paleontologist.
Paleontologist.
Yeah.
And so he put forth the idea of basically a sweepstakes, and so over millions of years, for whatever reason, lemurs got lucky and rafted over onto Madagascar. Not like rafts they created themselves, but they were sleeping in whatever trees they were in. They got knocked over on a superstorm, and then they got swept over to Madagascar. And so over millions and millions of years, the possibility of that is, not great, but it's, greater thanks to the amount of time involved. And so those are the two leading theories out there right now about how lemurs basically got on Madagascar.
Yeah. So, to the uninitiated on this, what do you mean rafting? Well, after massive storms and hurricanes, there are huge chunks of earth that are just floating out in the ocean, with trees on them and stuff like that, on which you could have lizards and tortoises and birds and eggs and pregnant females or whatever that could get, get out there. So you either swim out there or you float or you fly.
Yeah.
And, floating is hard if you're not, don't have a body type for that.
Yeah.
If you're a hippopotamus, for example, that's another example of that. So you have to get out there somewhere. So, in Darwin's notes, and even his footnotes for the origin of species, he part of his data collection was to write people and ask them, have you ever seen anything like this? And one of the subjects was, do you ever see big, huge rafts of dirt floating out there? And the answer was, yeah. Sometimes for weeks or months they're floating out there. It's like, aha. So that, they could by accident. You only need a pregnant female or maybe just one couple or something like that to get a founder population started on a remote island, and then you're off and running.
Yep. I would say the only thing that tripped me up with that was that would mean it's not just one raft has to take, one, species. It's all the species that are on Madagascar that had to have that happen. And so at one time there was pygmy hippopotamuses that were native to Madagascar. And so there's a lot of different species that, needed to get there, and they got there somehow.
Yeah. So that the other theory that during the last ice age, sea levels were 300 feet lower, but that's not enough to connect Madagascar to Africa, right?
No.
So they would have had to do, some kind of migration process there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
And maybe
so
a combination of both too. Like that, I think was kind of.
But really, even the Galapagos isn't that astonishing because it's not that far from the South American mainland. But these middle of the Pacific Ocean, like Easter Island, Pitcairn Island, or Hawaii, it's astonishing that anything gets out there and survives.
Yeah.
But I guess if you have millions of years, and
I was going to say that makes it the lottery ticket a little bit more palatable, I guess, is like that just millions of years.
The other thing I didn't realize until reading your book is how many different species of lemurs there are. I thought would there just be one or two? No, dozens or hundreds or something like that, right?
Yeah. So there's dozens of different species, and then there's different subspecies underneath those as well too. So, but they believe that all of that diversification happened on Madagascar itself. So there was like one original lemur species, and then it kind of they evolved from that.
Okay, but then there's some species, if I recall, you mentioned that looks like they have Asian origins rather than African origins. So they must have migrated across that huge Indian Ocean, which is vast. Yeah,
it is. Yeah, but they have also been just discovering, I guess, continental chunks, especially around in I forget the name of the islands just north of Madagascar. But around those islands, and so that gets them a little bit closer to India, and so it makes that migration a little bit more realistic, I guess.
Yeah. I remember seeing early sketches of a land bridge between South America and Africa when the continents were closer, and somehow they must have migrated across there. We'll put a land bridge, and then once you start doing it, there's land bridges all over the earth.
Oh man, and that would be a great thing, just because that was a great age. The 19th century was a great age for land bridges and just land bridge theories, and so a lot of times people would just do that just to help explain, just because it was the easiest thing to do, because all you needed was a ruler basically, and you can connect two places with a land bridge. And so I can only imagine how many land bridges there have been theorized in that time period.
And of course, as you point out, the Isthmus of Panama is a land bridge.
Yeah,
that's a real one.
It is, and that's a perfect example of how these land bridges work, especially on an animal migration thing. So you have Central American species moving into South America and vice versa. And so there's, kind of it happening both ways. It's a highway, and it's not just a one-way street. And so that's what gets tripped up about there being a land bridge to Madagascar, because it doesn't seem like any species came from Madagascar to Africa. It was all from Africa to Madagascar.
One directional, right. Yep.
Yeah, and then that would leave the possibility open for like why weren't other species found on Madagascar if there was a land bridge there?
Yeah, I remember when I took evolutionary biology from Bayard Bratstrom, who I've written about, because he was quite the character. Tuesday night, 7 to 10, evolutionary biology, and then the class met at a bar afterwards.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
That went to like 2 in the morning. Yeah, yeah, it was great. He just died, age 92. Just died last week, so I was sad to see that. But he used to tell us about the studies done on Krakatoa after it erupted, whenever that was, 1889 or something like that, where there were islands around it in which every single organism was dead. There was nothing alive. So biologists went there and said, okay, let's see how long it takes before these get repopulated. And it was in no time. Wow. I mean, just life finds a way very, very quickly.
Oh, that's amazing. That is amazing to look at and think about, too.
And then there's other weird things about islands where animals either get much larger or they get much smaller, dwarfism and gigantism, like the Komodo dragon is a gigantic lizard, all right? Or you get the little pygmy hippos that you wrote about. And then there's those humans, the hominids in, what were they? The Hobbit people, they called them.
Yeah.
I think that was in somewhere near Borneo, one of those little islands in the Malay archipelago. And that wasn't that long ago. I think they died out maybe 10, 12,000 years ago or something. So I remember when that story broke, it's like, maybe there's still some there, hiding out in the caves or something. Go look. Yeah. I mean, that would be astonishing. But they were tiny. I forget what the theory is about, because maybe it's you have no predators, so you don't need to be large, or I don't know, something like that. Anyway, it's super interesting. Okay, let's transition to the characters in your book. So you go from a purely scientific question, biogeography, migration of organisms, to let's start with Ernst Haeckel, bringing in humans, and then quasi pseudo-scientific theories about the racial rankings of people, and you got to have this island, and then you're off and running.
Yeah. So he was dealing with basically human evolution. So he was very much a big time proponent of Darwinism and Darwin's theories related to evolution, which were very brand new at the time that Haeckel was writing. And that was, I think he wrote The History of Creation in 1874 or something around that time. So it was basically in between Darwin's On the Origin of Species and The Descent of Man. So in between that period. And so he wrote his History of Creation. And so he goes really hard into looking at human evolution. And so for him, he needed this paradise for that human evolution to take place. And he was using Philip Lutley Schlater's idea of this Lemurian land bridge. And so he placed human evolution on Lemuria. And he drew that map, that beautiful map that he did, right there, right smack dab in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And so for him, that was where the proto-humans, the kind of like ape-like humans, really developed into like two-legged hominids. And then, from there, they migrated out into the different
patterns
areas
he presents.
Yeah, so he has all these little arrows of all of the different races and how they ended up all the different places. And so you can see right there, right off the tip of India is Lemuria. And it's, he has people going to the Dutch the East Indies, people's going into Africa and up into India and elsewhere. So it's so for that was provided the perfect basically components for humanity to develop was there on Lemuria. And so it's just another of like solidifying the idea of there being this place called Lemuria too. So which was very much key in like the development of what came later in the Lemurian story was just having this kind of like scientific street cred to like just help solidify it in people's minds. And his book was like surprisingly popular for its time and for its day. It was one of the primary ways that Darwin's ideas and just evolutionary thought got to, the mass public, and went through dozens and dozens of editions in many different languages. And in each edition, he kept updating it with the latest research as well. So it was, the primarily, and as industrial society was coming about, and as there was becoming a more middle class, people had more time to, read books like The History of Creation. And so they were getting their ideas about what was going on, about, just science in general. And so it was really influential and helped create, this idea that there was a Lemuria out there one time in the Pacific Ocean or in the Indian Ocean.
So you talk about that debate, monogenism versus wait, did I say that right? Polygenism, right? It's just the origins of humanity. Mm-hmm. Let me make sure I get those terms right. Monogenists and polygenists. So the question is, where did all the races come from? Was there one single race to begin with, and all the races are derivatives of the single race, or were there multiple creation events? Now, it's a 19th century way of putting it. I think in the 1990s, all the way, there was the out of Africa hypothesis versus, a single hominid population migrates out of Africa and populates the rest of the world, or were there multiple origins, not completely origins from, a primate, but just that some proto-human population migrates out of Africa, and then they become different species. They speciate out from there. And anyway, so it's an interesting debate.
It really is. And like when I was researching it, I am by no means an evolutionary biologist or anything like that. I'm a historian. So, but I was researching it, and I was surprised about like all of the fossil record and them finding, these evolutionary dead ends and everything else happening too. So there's a lot more going on, I guess, in the evolution of humanity than is commonly known to, people like myself or really anyone else who isn't really like in the weeds there with it.
Yeah, here's what you quote in your book from Haeckel. So this is, Haeckel was a monogenist, meaning he believed in a single origin for mankind. Because there was a single origin, if you go back far enough, he would go back all the way to tracing mankind to bacteria to prove that there was one primeval home. Here is Haeckel. But there are a number of circumstances, especially chronological facts, which suggest that the primeval home of man was a continent now sunk below the surface of the Indian Ocean, which extended along the south of Asia as it is at present, and probably in direct connection with it, towards the east as far as further India and the Sunda Islands, toward the west as far as Madagascar and the southeastern shores of Africa. Sclater has given this continent the name of Lemuria. By assuming this Lemuria to have been man's primeval home, we greatly facilitate the explanation of the geographical distribution of the human species by migration. That sounds innocent enough. It's a technical problem.
But
right. Go ahead and layer in what they were really thinking in terms of racial ranking of superior versus inferior races.
Yeah, so I guess we didn't say it at first, but Ernst Haeckel was a German biologist, microbiologist, kind of like he was these protozoa, basically studying the evolution of like single cell organisms and some basic organisms as well. But the German, I guess, is the most key thing there. And so he went about basically trying to rank the races where these Aryan/German race would end up at the tippy top of the racial hierarchy. And who would have thought, right?
Right.
And so, but he's very much I guess it's of the time too, because it's not really a big stretch because everybody was doing that at the time. But there was actually some that weren't. There was a couple of biologists out there I found that were actually saying, there is no true difference between the races of people. There was, we're all the same. But for the most part, most serious scientists were in the Haeckel camp of just trying to find ways of, denigrating basically races of color and trying to find ways of showing how the white race was superior to others and finding scientific means of doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was really in the water. I mean, pretty much everybody believed it. Darwin, in fact, was something of a progressive liberal by his standards, appalled by slavery and the treatment of people of color and so on. Not that he was a 21st century liberal, but because nobody was, but including Lincoln and Jefferson and all these great champions of freedom and equality. They didn't actually believe it for the races. You see in Haeckel's drawings, first it was more of a, richly branching bush, certainly, but there was a certain direction to it. So this is one of the other themes in the history of evolutionary thought, is that evolution has direction to it, directionality. It's going from simple to complex, from less intelligent to more intelligent, and so forth. And so once you graft that concept onto human evolution, then you're going to put, white Europeans at the top, and so on, and just start ranking them down the scale, phylogenetic scale you go. So then you got to go searching. Well, where was that original race from? And why did their skin get black? So the original skin color must have been white, and from some northern continent somewhere, some individual source, and then it was corrupted. After that, that's kind of the theme of that.
Yeah, and what's surprising is like all of the kind of native peoples of the like Southeast Asia and Australia and out in the Pacific, those were in Haeckel's estimation some of the lower races, and also like Madame Blavatsky, when she gets a hold of that as well, she would hold them in the same regard too. So it's kind of these are the people who I guess are most like the Lemurians on Lemuria for Haeckel, and that's how he treats them, like the less evolved races.
Yeah, there was another theme in there about why would they be different depending on their geography, and it had to do with temperature, right? Warmer, hotter climates are not conducive to creativity and building civilization and so on. It's like, oh yeah, what about the Egyptians? It's pretty hot there.
I was going to say,
a pretty thriving civilization for thousands of years. Oh, they're not really black. They're red. Or like, what? No, anyway, by today's standards, it's just insane. Okay, so now let's transition to some of the kind of romanticized versions of this. James Churchland and Ignatius Donnelly and all the other Madame Blavatsky. Just kind of walk us through some of those ideas. They're so interesting.
Yeah, and so so Haeckel was writing at I think his book History of Creation was translated into English at the early 1880s. And right on the heels of that, Madame Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, she writes her book, The Secret Doctrine. So where Haeckel was only interested in evolution, physical evolution of species, and primarily, humans, Blavatsky was interested in the spiritual evolution of humanity. I find it very interesting that she was, caught up in this kind of like evolutionary zeitgeist at the time. And she felt that she needed to get in on that, or at least, provide her own take on it. And so Lemuria played a significant role in her spiritual evolution of mankind. And so for her, there were 7 root races, with Lemuria being home of the 3rd root race. And so it was an important step because it's where the first 2 root races were purely spiritual, non-physical beings or just concepts. And it's only in the 3rd root race on Lemuria that they gained actual physical, evolved into physical, manifestations. And the first humans were, these large, like 100-foot tall giant creatures. And over the 3rd root race on Lemuria, they evolved into more kind of human-sized, but not quite human-sized at the end, beings, like human beings. And like that's also where we had 1 eye, then we evolved to have 2 eyes, but then our pituitary gland turned into a third eye and all of that kind of stuff going on. And that was what was used for like telekinetic or telepathic powers of communicating across great distances. And so you have all of that happening on Lemuria for her. But she did something really interesting in that she goes out of her way to say she's only using the name Lemuria because that's what Haeckel used and that's what Slater used in their writing. So she was very much reading everybody else's, like all of the other scientific work that was going on at the time and just providing her own kind of alternative spiritual takes on it. And she was very much against Haeckel too. She was propping Haeckel up as basically a straw man to throw her ideas off against. And so, but like she would steal a bunch of his ideas as well, especially when it comes like to the very, like in the like the hermaphroditic budding of species and things like that, and how we could have evolved to. So she was taking some of Haeckel's own ideas and theories and using them in her own kind of spiritual evolutionary thought.
Yeah. So where did she get these seven stages of?
Yeah. 7 root races. Yeah.
What was the origin of her ideas for that? I mean, where are these giants? How does she know that? How does she know they existed somewhere?
Well, those come from, because she had a very, I would say, mysterious and convoluted backstory to her. So she grew up in Russia. Her father was a Russian cavalryman, but her grandparents and her mother were very kind of steeped in occult traditions. They were very like well read and like just all of the like occult readings at the time. And so she was growing up in the 1840s, 1850s. And then she got married really young, but she kind of left that husband and kind of just ran away. She just ran away from home and like lived on the road, traveled the world apparently for 20 some years, and then ended up in New York City in the late 1860s, early 1870s. And then that's where she becomes this, Madame Blavatsky, basically. And she founds the Theosophical Society with Henry Still Alcott and others. And then they move over to India to kind of create their base there. But she was pulling from, so on her travels there, this mysterious middle period of her life, where there's no real record of her anywhere, but she claims to have gotten into Tibet, which was very difficult to do. There was really no Westerners that had entered into Tibet. And it was there in Tibet that she learned this mystical teachings from these ascended masters, her ascended masters there. So Kuthumi and Master Morea, all in her own special secret language as well. So she was reading a bunch of secret teachings in a secret language from secret masters. So it's very convenient that no one else had access to them. But those were the ones who kind of gave her these ideas that there were these 7 root races. And when she's going through, so she's, in one hand, she's quoting Haeckel and she's quoting, Wallace and all these other scientists of the day. But then she's just pulling quotes from these secret books that she was given access to from these masters. So it was, you get both sides of the Blavatsky there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a super interesting story because that's like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. There's always this kind of mysterious middle passage. They disappear, they go away, they face these challenges, and then they come back with a special message for humanity or their group or whatever. It's like, well, what about that middle? What were they doing exactly? Right. And even Jesus, what was he doing? The story kind of picks up when he's 30.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
The whole story is only 3 years long, right? Mm-hmm. He was just a 3-year preacher, and that's it. And then he's crucified.
Yeah.
Or you get like L. Ron Hubbard. He was in the Navy and he traveled the world and he met with all these great people and he got all this knowledge. Pretty much none of which was true, but
yeah,
that's in that tradition of occult knowledge. It's acceptable as an epistemology to get knowledge from some non-empirical sources.
Yes.
Meditation or just you get it from on high in your dreams, or it just popped into my head. That's legitimate. That, all the way back to the Rosicrucians, and you wrote about Hermes Trismegistus, of this Hermes Trice Great, ancient knowledge gets passed along, and it's so talk about that a little bit. I mean, that it's steeped in that.
Yeah, and you bring up because I saw a lot of similarities with Jesus, not so much direct similarities with her, but she would have these almost quasi miracles associated with her, basically paranormal like activity around her that she conjured up. So like weird knocks. She had this. A couple of the famous stories around her were like, finding this china set buried out in the middle of the woods or something like that. Or this lady that came and visited her and had lost a brooch. And Blavatsky said, look in that, like the cushion right there. And it was in there. And so you have these like almost miracles to help give her, help like her message out, like, and she has her own kind of like alternative spiritual theology all around her as well. And it seems like the miracles around Blavatsky were there to kind of like prop up those, to give credence to, what she was actually saying about these, root races and people's individuality and spiritualness and being able, basically like being your own God and stuff like that. So very much borrowing or appropriating from Eastern religions, primarily, Buddhism and Hinduism. But she was also one of the first Westerners to like expose people to those ideas as well.
Well, you wrote about Edgar Cayce, same thing, the sleeping prophet. He would just go to sleep and have a dream, and that was his source of knowledge. Like, I figured it out. How did you figure it out? It just came to me in a dream. Yeah. Oh,
that's lovely.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, to the modern ear, that just sounds batshit crazy. But, fact checking in journalism and peer review and history, these are fairly new, like barely a century old. Before that, people just wrote stories however they wanted to write stories. The point wasn't to tell an accurate story. It was some other purpose.
Yeah. And so the weird thing with Cayce for me was he had, decades of doing this before he started talking about these lost continents. And the lost continents were very much a pivotal point in his whole spiel. Because he was, people would write to them and ask him for medical advice, basically, about what was going on. And so he would equate all of that to their past lives in Atlantis primarily, but they would also talk about past lives in Lemuria. But he didn't do that for the first 20 years of doing that. And so it's like he all of a sudden just found out about Atlantis and Lemuria, well into his whole sleeping prophet routine. So like, who knows where he actually found that information or learned about that information or why he decided like, oh, let's lean hard on the Atlantis angle.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good time to bring in Atlantis, Ignatius, Donnelly, and connect that to Lemuria and all that. Go ahead. That's such a great story.
So right now, like, Atlantis is almost a given in our day and age now. Like, most everybody probably knows about Atlantis and in one form or another. And so it's pretty known. But back in the late 19th century, it was not a known thing at the time. So it was really we have one person to thank for all of this, Atlantis talk today, and that's Ignatius Donnelly, who was a failed politician, failed American politician, who he served in the House of Representatives during the Civil War, and then afterwards, kind of like was in the Minnesota State House and stuff like that. But and his in between his political misfortunes, like being out of office and in office, he was like just researching Atlantis on the side, and up to that point no one had really done that. No one had really done a deep dive research into finding out where Atlantis was or what Atlantis was it real or not. There was a lot of, like, people writing about it, famously, like I think Sir Francis Bacon wrote about it in his, I think, New Atlantis treatise, but that was also a kind of like a quasi satiric, not satirical, but almost a political work talking about like a utopian society, which is like what Plato basically wrote it as when he originally wrote it in his dialogues. And so, like, between Plato and Donnelly, there was really only one other person that kind of looked into the history of it, and it was I think it was a 16th century Swedish doctor who thought that Atlantis was actually was in Sweden. But that work was never translated into any other language, and so it was kind of not well known. But then Donnelly comes around and writes his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And he very much is like doing this diffusionist history talk, like pulling different, artifacts from different parts of the world and tying them together, or hieroglyphs from South American, native peoples, and, also Egypt, and trying to tie those together. And he was saying they were all happening there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, around the Azores, on Atlantis. And the book was a huge hit. It was like a huge, hit for its day. It became really popular, and it stayed in print for like 60 or 70 years straight. And you can still find it. I was in the bookstore the other day, like a used bookstore, and there was 2 copies of it. And I was surprised to see that. Yeah, I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Yeah. And so it's still out there and still around. And it's like, it hasn't, like, Atlantis hasn't gone away since. And in it, he does bring up Lemuria a couple of times, but it also creates this playbook for how to determine how these lost civilizations were formed and lived, and how to go about like proving their existence. One that's still in play today. And what he was doing in the 1880s is not that far removed from what, Eric von Daniken has done in the 1950s, or, really what Graham Hancock has done in the 1980s and 90s and on up to today, and many, 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 many others. So he was kind of like the first in that regards. And so there would be others like Colonel James Churchward, who would take that same tract and do the same thing, but with Lemuria, and trying to find these connections between like the Pacific Islanders people and the people of South America and elsewhere, and try to like form this cultural connection to create this idea of there being a large Pacific-based continent.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the idea of a lost civilization is not completely crazy, because around this time is when Egyptology became a thing, and it's like, oh my God, there was this great civilization, and we're constantly finding stuff. And then, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, and India and China, these great civilizations. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, so it's not completely crazy to think, well, maybe there's another one over there.
Yeah.
Let's go look.
And it was also the same time when like the Smithsonian was doing like mound building, like finding the mound builders here in America, and doing that kind of like quasi amateur, archaeology here in America as well.
Yeah. So I think just kind of to wax philosophical about this for a moment, I think this is around the time when science is gaining sort of social cultural power. I mean, the word scientist wasn't even coined until the 1850s. There was science as general knowledge. Before science, there was really just natural philosophy. I mean, Newton's book was a book of natural philosophy. And the idea I mentioned earlier of like fact-checking in journalism and peer review and accuracy in history, that's pretty new. Again, stories were told for other reasons for thousands of years. And in this period of time, some of these guys like Donnelly are going, this is not just a story. This is actually true. that's a pretty new idea. Here's what I wrote about Atlantis in my book, Heavens on Earth, when I was writing about attempts to, think about how to create a utopia on Earth. Utopian fantasies that serve as social commentary, in fact, are what most of these works are really about. Consider the lost continent of Atlantis, a mythic utopia that has been projected to have been in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Canaries or the Azores being remnants, Iceland or Sweden, you mentioned Sweden, the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. The evidence for the lost continent evidently washed away when it vanished beneath the waves, but that hasn't quelled the imagination of utopian hunters. In 1954, you quote L. Sprague de Camp, counted 216 different Atlantists out there somewhere, only 37 of which concluded that Atlantis was imaginary or allegorical, with the rest convinced that the real lost continent could be found. 1989, the French underwater treasure hunter Pierre Jarnac tallied over 5,000 book titles about Atlantis, and this was pre-internet. In his 2012 book, Atlantis in the Textual Sea, Andrea Albini reported over 23 million web pages devoted to Atlantis. There is, in fact, no point in searching for Atlantis because Plato made up the story as a social commentary on Athens and a warning to his fellow Athenians to pull back from the precipice that war and wealth was taking them over. This is just me talking now. In the Timaeus, Plato's Dialogus Critias, explains that Egyptian priests told the Greek wise man Solon that his ancestors once defeated a mighty empire located just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, usually identified by Atlantologists as the Straits of Gibraltar. This vast power gathered into one, endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours, and the whole of the region within the straits. And then, Solon, your country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. But afterward there were violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. Critias described Atlantis as a series of circular canals. Anyway, it goes on and on about the description of that. The fodder for Plato's imagination came from his experiences growing up at the terminus of Athens' golden age, brought about in part by the costly wars against the Spartans and Carthaginians. He visited cities such as Syracuse, featuring numerous Atlantean-like temples, and Carthage, whose circular harbor was controlled from a central island, as in Atlantis. Earthquakes were common. When Plato was 55, one leveled the city of Hellas, only 40 miles from Athens, and most tellingly, the year before he was born, an earthquake flattened a military outpost on the small island of Atlante. Plato wove historical fact into literary myth, as he did for his more famous work, The Republic, in this case to warn how a utopia can become corrupted into a dystopia. Anyway, that's my take on that.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting also about, like, if you're going back to the Plato itself, two things that always popped up to me was he basically created the idea of, like, going to Egypt and receiving, like, occult knowledge from these mystical people. So that's like, Blavatsky did that, and countless of others have had that as, like, their backstory as well. And the other thing is, like, I forget which one came first and which one came. The one with the most detailed description of Atlantis, either Critias or Timaeus. It just stops at the end. Like, it's just like mid Zeus smiting Atlantis. It just stops. And it's Plato's only dialogue that just ends abruptly. Like, we have no other reference to there being, like, any lost like Plato dialogues or anything like that. And so it's very conspicuous that, like, he would, like, not finish this one. So it was almost like an unfinished album for him. So it's like, why would he not get around to finishing? Because he wrote other dialogues afterwards. It's not like he passed away or something. It's just like, for whatever reason, the idea just wasn't, like, a good one for him to, like, continue on with.
It's not a great story. I'm going to try a new one.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but the whole thing is a little bit like Nostradamus's quatrains about the future. He was writing social commentary in his own time, which you were not allowed to do, not predicting Hitler and Napoleon and so forth. So,
yeah, he's very, very interesting, and no one, and, like, none of the people after Plato have, like, was, like, taking it up and trying to find this mystical mythical Atlantis, like, Aristotle basically made fun of it, and other philosophers after Plato were like coming up with their own kind of like lost continents themselves, and to like poke fun at Plato. So it's interesting, like how we take that seriously, but the people of his day or just after his day didn't really take it seriously.
Yeah, as another example of different kinds of truths that I've been playing with for my next book. We're talking about empirical truths, scientific truths, and so on, things that you can actually test and see, measure, infer, and so on. But just take literary truths. No one would ask, is there really a Middle Earth that exists from J.R.R. Tolkien's, Lord of the Rings? Well, no. What are you talking? What do you mean? This is a story.
Yeah.
Great story. Were there really four brothers Karamazov in Dostoevsky's great work, and or Jane Austen, or is there really a train station 9 3/4 in Harry Potter? What? Of course not. It's a story. So why would we understand that difference, but not look at ancient literature in the same way? They're just making stories up for some other reason, including biblical stories. And that I've been trying this out on Christians, and it doesn't fly really well. Maybe the resurrection didn't actually happen. Maybe it carries a different message, and they're like, "Oh no, no, none of this mythic truth stuff." I'm channeling my inner Jordan Peterson. It's mythically true. It carries deeper truths for your life. No. He really lived. He was really killed, and he really rose from the dead after 3 days. It's like, okay,
what?
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I find it with Plato, like it was also his only attempt at doing any kind of history, like or claimed to be history. With other works, there was obvious there's that like that distance there, that literary almost creation going on, but this was his only attempt at like trying to say that something that actually happened in the past. Or giving it that like air of history by putting it in Solon's words, and Solon was a person at the time, or generations before actually Plato. But then even then he was like, I can't finish this. This is not going anywhere for me.
Yeah. So to me, these stories carry important messages or homilies about human nature, society, relationships, and so on. I think it's a misreading to take it literally. You can, but there's something about romancing the past. Okay, so let's talk about Graham Hancock for a minute, because all this stuff that you write about is really predecessors to him. He's quick to distance himself from Van Doniken. He's not claiming these are ancient aliens, but that there's an ancient advanced civilization. And, there's something, I don't know, I've read all his books and I know him. We were on Rogan together, and I like him. He is a compelling storyteller and writer. Yeah. The British accent helps too. And the American audience anyway. But there is something, I have to say, when I read this stuff, it's like, yeah, maybe there was these wise people that sailed around the world 10,000, 11,000 years ago, and they imparted wisdom. I don't know, what is it that's appealing about that?
Well, it's so easy though. Like it's easy to do the story, but it's hard to prove the story, I think. And so like I watched his Netflix special that came out a couple years ago, and it was good. It was fairly entertaining, but it was like he was very much holding up like archaeologist as this like just beating him up for whatever reason. And it's like, man, they would love to like they would love nothing else than to like say what you're saying, but they just need that proof, and like you're not providing that proof. Like coming up with your own stories based on your own interpretations of whatever archaeological findings that are at the sites that he visits and things like that. Aren't proof, right? It's like they need something more, and so it just takes time and effort and generations of research and digging and finding that information to make that so. But just telling those stories, it's sexy and it's appealing, and they're just good stories as well too. So
Yeah, again, like the Ancient Aliens, I love that series. I don't believe any of it, but it's not impossible. In fact, it's probably pretty likely that there are extraterrestrial intelligences out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Have they come here? Very probably not. It's a vast, empty cosmos. It's hard to get anywhere. But the idea that they could be out there, that's appealing. It's almost like a religious impulse. There's something out there vastly smarter and more moral than us. They know we're here. They visited us. They care about it. Something like that. That's the kind of that religious impulse. Graham's isn't quite like that. It's a different kind. That there's sort of hope for our civilization in that these great wise people, figured out what was going on with potential disasters. This Younger Dryas extinction event. That Graham thinks these ancient wise people are sending us a message. Be careful what you do. Nuclear weapons or global warming or whatever. Something like that. Or there could be another meteor stream that wipes us out. Something like that. It's the same kind of religious impulse that, I don't know, it does appeal as a story.
Yeah, it does. And it is an appealing story. I think it's a little... I'm always hesitant with them just because it takes away kind of some agency from the native peoples that are dealing with all of this too. So it's just...
Yeah, Graham's sensitive about that because he gets accused of being like a 19th century racist like Donnelly or these guys.
Yeah.
You're just saying, those brown people couldn't have built those amazing structures because, no, I don't know. What do you mean? Well, they're not white. He doesn't say anything remotely like that. He has a different motive, I think, but he's been accused of that, and he's sensitive about that. But still, that I think it just underestimates what hunter-gatherers are capable of. Like with Göbekli Tepe. This was 11,500 years. Okay, so there was no vast civilizations with farming and division of labor and slave labor and that kind of stuff. Still, they managed to do it. Maybe they're just more impressive than we can imagine. And I can't think of how to move a big block of stone, but what do I know?
Yeah.
I don't think I'd survive a week in the wilderness. So what does that mean?
But what's also, it kind of goes back to the whole sweepstakes thing. So give people enough time and a problem to solve, and they will, solve that problem. And so if you have years, decades, even centuries to solve that problem, to move that block or move those blocks or whatever, I think, they can find a way. Like you said, life will find a way.
Yes. Yeah. Just a couple points on that. Why I think Graham is probably not correct is his argument's all based on the argument from ignorance or personal incredulity, because I don't accept the archaeologist's explanation for how this particular structure was built. Therefore, my counter theory should be taken seriously. Well, maybe they're wrong. Maybe there's some other explanation. But most of those explanations archaeologists have, they're not bad. Yeah. It's, how the Easter Islanders moved those big statues. There's, different theories about it. We're not 100% sure, but that doesn't mean, therefore, aliens did it or the advanced civilization. He does give us a clue. Hardly anybody reads this passage when he's on podcasts, for example. But at the end of his book, America Before, which is about the mound people and all the different peopling of the Americas, and what archaeologists think about that and why he's skeptical of the archaeologist story, he says at the end, I suppose the time has come to say in print what I've already said many times in public Q&A sessions at my lectures, and that, in my view, the science of the lost civilization was primarily focused upon what we now call psi capacities, PSI, psychic power, ESP, telekinesis, capacities that deployed the enhanced and focused power of human consciousness to channel energies and to manipulate matter. My speculation, which I will not attempt to prove here or to support with evidence, but merely present for consideration, is that the advanced civilization I see evolving in North America during the last ice age had transcended leverage and mechanical advantage and learned to manipulate matter and energy by deploying powers of consciousness that we have not yet begun to tap. In action, such power would look something like magic even today and must have seemed supernatural and godlike to the hunter-gatherers who shared the Ice Age world with these mysterious adepts. That's a little bit like some of the people you write
No,
about who believe in
it's exactly like what Blavatsky wrote about and her advanced civilization, especially when she talks about Lemurians and Atlanteans, and then the second wave of theosophists that came after her, Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater, and particularly Rudolf Steiner. That's almost like word for word what Rudolf Steiner says in his books. And so, yeah, I see like almost direct corollaries there between those.
So the idea would be this ancient advanced people were also spiritually more advanced.
Yeah.
And that would include these kinds of powers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so like each, especially, almost every iteration of Lemurians, especially after Blavatsky, they would have these, different powers, basically either, spiritual psi powers. Steiner, when he writes about it in his book, Cosmic Memory, I believe, he talks basically like the Lemurians there have Jedi-like powers, and they can move objects with their mind and communicate with each other across continents and things like that. And so, and then it goes up until today, and we have crystal mountains inside of Mount Shasta, or crystal cities inside of Mount Shasta, where people are living in a 5-dimensional world or whatever, and things like that. And so it's not too far removed from what he was discussing and talking about. It's just a modern version.
I'll have to ask him. I don't know his work that well, but I have to ask him if he has any antecedents to his ideas that come from those sources. I wonder if he read Steiner or Blavatsky and thought maybe there's something to that. I just don't know. But it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, all of us get our ideas from other people. Very rarely does it come from on high. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've seen the Joe Rogan podcast with Graham, and Flint Dibble is his name. He's an archaeologist and probably named Flint. His father was an archaeologist. Thanks, Dad. Call me Flint. Mm-hmm. He's a super nice guy and really smart. And he just laid it out there, because Graham keeps saying, because people like me keep asking, where's the evidence? Like with the UAPs, where's the photographs? Where's the, and his argument is always, well, just turn the next turn of the spade. It could reveal, what I'm talking about here. Mm-hmm. And so Flint puts this slide up, because Joe has the big screen there, and they each have their PowerPoints. And he shows it was something like 3,250 hunter-gatherer sites all over the world that archaeologists have uncovered. It's just vast. Mm-hmm. It's like not a single fossil from or artifact from any of these sites show, I don't know, like electrical wires, 12,000 years ago or something. Mm-hmm. There's just nothing. It's all pretty much, it's just hunter-gatherer level material stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's when Graham kind of shifts to the spiritual. Well, I mean advanced. I don't mean advanced like technologically. I mean spiritually, mentally, consciously. They had a higher consciousness. Like, okay, that gets fuzzy enough that you can't really, there's not much more to say about that.
Yeah, you can't debate that, though. That's the thing. It's like, you can't prove that. You can't really, debate that. So I guess that's a wise move on his part.
Yeah, because if you say, well, go ahead and move that block with your mind, it's like, well, today we don't have this capacity because we're, corrupted by the material world or something like this. Yeah.
5G.
Yeah. 5G. Yes, the 5G routers have ruined our psychic power. Yeah. So, but in general, okay, just kind of pull back on the wider picture, this, idea of kind of progress and evolution, that we were once great, make America great again. Well, it's just make civilization great again or something. There is this kind of pull, this idea of progress in history. There's whole books about this. There's more of these, the golden ages of X. Although the ancient Greeks believed, that there was a golden age before them, and that it's always that the people before us had it great, and we just need to get back to what they were doing.
And it's never, really that case. Like, and we always, have those rose tinted glasses and looking back at the past. But, there was incredible hardships by those people, and then them trying to, just suffer through each day and making it through. And so it's disingenuous, I guess, on people's ideas that there was, once greatness and trying to get back to it.
I would not want to live as a hunter-gatherer, if for nothing else, the dentistry.
Yeah, right.
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be terrible. Here's from the other chapter in my book, Heavens on Earth, on dystopias. The line dividing fiction and fact in utopias and dystopias is a thin one. In their book, Why Not Kill Them All? The Logic and Prevention of Mass Political Murder, Daniel Shareau and Clark Macaulay draw the parallels between Christian and Marxist eschatology. In Marx's pre-lapsarian world, there was no private property, no classes or class division, no alienation between employees and employers. But then came the fall and the invention of private property, leading to exploitation and economic classes of haves and have-nots. This sinful world can only last so long before the apocalypse, in which a final terrible revolution will wipe out capitalism, alienation, exploitation, and inequality. The chosen people in this eschatology are naturally the communists, with Marx as their savior. Then there's Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, another imagined eschatological scenario with Christian parallels, as Shareau and Macaulay elaborate, now quoting them. It was not an accident that Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich, a millennium of perfection, similar to the 1,000-year reign of goodness promised in Revelation before the return of evil, in the great battle between good and evil, and the final triumph of God over Satan. The entire imagery of his Nazi party and regime was deeply mystical, suffused with religious, often Christian, liturgical symbolism, and it appealed to a higher law, to a mission decreed by fate and trusted in the prophet Hitler. Amazing.
Yeah, it is. You read that, and it reminds me of exactly what has happened to Lemuria and the discourse around Lemuria. So all of these different iterations of, Lemuria, it's just very much a utopian society. But now it's still a utopian society, but people use it as hold it up as this is what happens to society when you allow wokeness, when you allow science to rule. It destroys this, spiritual utopian place. And so it's very much has become that kind of like good versus evil aspects to it, where, you have, basically, religion or spirituality versus, science and empirical knowledge going at each other. And what happens when you allow that empirical knowledge society to rule? It destroys, the beauty of a place like Atlantis or Lemuria.
Yeah, if we could just get back to then. I think you're quoting from Haeckel here on page 78. The seventh root rate. The seventh root rate. Oh, that might be Blavatsky. The whole cosmos is guided, controlled, and animated by almost endless series of hierarchies and sentient beings, each having a mission to perform, and who, whether we give it to them one name or another, are messengers, in the sense that only that they are agents of karmic and cosmic law. That's Blavatsky, right?
Yeah.
The whole order of nature evinces a progressive march toward a higher life. There is design in the action of the seemingly blindest forces. The whole process of evolution with its endless adaptations is proof of this. The immutable laws that weed out the weak and feeble species to make room for the strong, and which ensure the survival of the fittest, though so cruel in their immediate action, are all working toward the grand end. Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing, just kind of weaving in a evolutionary theory, which is modern for them, with these ancient wisdom traditions and spiritualism.
Yeah, and to me, that's impressive for her. Like, I don't believe anything she's saying, but it's impressive that she's taking all of this knowledge and blending it together for itself. Especially what we have now in terms of like alternative spirituality and its like shallowness. Her just even, delving into the idea of including evolutionary thought into her whole theology is actually, I won't say refreshing, but it's more encouraging than some of the stuff we have today.
be interesting if someone like you 500 years from now writes about the 21st century. Look at these crazy things that people then believed.
Yeah, right.
I wonder what they are. I don't know.
Exactly.
Probably, maybe some of this stuff. Oh, also in your section on there's Edgar Cayce, you mentioned J.Z. Knight, another one of my favorite stories. Again, this kind of ancient spiritual occult channeling is this, I'm getting information when I go into this trance and I channel this, in her case, Ramtha, this 35,000-year-old spirit warrior that speaks English, interestingly enough, with an Indian accent or something. It's like, where was this 35,000 years ago when they spoke English?
And she gets so violent too, which is funny. Like her version of Atlantis and Lemuria is so much more violent than everybody else's too. So
yeah. Well, he was a warrior. Ramtha was a warrior. Maybe it's something like that. I don't know if you know the story about this, but there was a German psychic who started channeling Ramtha, and J.Z. Knight sued her for copyright. Like, I made up Ramtha. Wait, what? I thought you said he's out there somewhere and you're just channeling him. Shouldn't anybody be able to, pick up the phone? I thought that was very revealing. Yeah,
that is very. I have to look up that case. I just researched a. So in the book, I talk about a dweller on two places, and which basically sets out the idea of there being this mystical Mount Shasta. And the guy who wrote it by the name of Frederick Spencer Oliver. So he died, and the book was published after his death. But then, like, the guy and Edna Ballard and their I Am activity movement organization basically like stole large chunks of the book, and so Oliver's family like sued them for copyright. But just because the case was dismissed, just because Oliver throughout the whole book said that he wasn't writing the book, it was him channeling the spirit, and it was written from the spirit's point of view and stuff like that. And so just because of that, he couldn't come back and claim that he had copyright protection on the spiritual information coming forth.
Right. There was another story like that too. We were talking about Jesus, the Dan Brown novel. What was the name of his novel?
The Da Vinci Code.
The Da Vinci Code, right.
Yeah.
Well, the authors of a book in the 70s, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, that was their idea.
Oh, yeah.
So they said he ripped us off, and he said, well, I'm just writing a novel. I'm just making shit up. You're claiming it's true. But again, that touches on that same theme. Jesus didn't actually die. He was on the cross and he was in a coma or something. He woke up and they whisked him off to France, and he married Mary Magdalene, and the family is still with us. The family line is still here. Something like that. Again, no evidence for this. It's just a novel, but still, it's one of those romantic stories. It's hard to not be compelled to read stuff like that.
Yeah. And what's more powerful than like the allegorical reading of that, and like I like the Last Temptation of Christ, the book or the movie talks about like it's basically that idea, but it's like living in his head in that moment of death, and like that's where his mind goes, of this like nice human life, but he has to give it all up. So.
All right, Dustin, that's a good place to end. What are you working on next?
I have a book on colonial Philadelphia coming out later this year.
Oh my God.
And so,
really?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
interesting.
Yeah. So I'm doing a look at like a cultural, societal history of colonial Philadelphia. It's called Raising Philadelphia, the Making of America's First Great City. And so it's basically all the things that were going on in from 1750 to 1775, or to the eve of the revolution, or I guess the Declaration of Independence. And things.
Oh, that sounds so interesting. Okay, we'll have you back for that. All right, Justin, thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.